Well, inviting two intellectual historians to talk about democracy, elections don't matter. We're pretty pessimistic before and after the election. We're just a little bit more pessimistic now than we just used to be a couple of weeks ago. I'm mainly my work focuses on political theory, but with a historical angle. I'm particularly interested, of course, in the history of political thought, and at the center of that, as Tony mentioned, is sort of like normative democratic theory. And what is that? Well, what I'm looking at is sort of basically what are the normative conditions for the possibility and legitimacy of democracy. And part of that, and what's really important, is the way in which political philosophers, political theorists, political scientists, but also public figures, public intellectuals speak about political life. What I'm studying, what I'm looking at is ultimately the language that they use, because language is a speech act, and especially in the political world, it's a performative speech act. And these speech acts, of course, take place within a particular kind of historical context. They mean something different in different historical contexts. And think about something like the people, or freedom, or citizenship, or civil society, and one of them is community. And I've sort of like found it sort of like really sort of strange that there's sort of like an upswing among political theorists that have an interest in community since the early 1980s. And sort of like I was sort of like interested in this and started to follow this a little bit more across the entire political spectrum. So I looked at conservative and far-right public intellectuals, but I also looked at the center, and I also looked at sort of post-Marxist new left intellectuals as well, and on both sides of the Atlantic ultimately. And what I found was sort of like a suspicion that I had, and I kind of follow up on this, which was a suspicion about the sort of like intrinsic link that we sometimes attach to this relationship between community and democracy, that somehow community is crucial to democracy, and that community is a model according to which we can organize our political life. And I'm, a little bit worried about that, but that's probably just because I'm German and the son of a civil servant. But that's entirely different story. So there are, of course, some caveats. I do not deny in any way that communities can be politically relevant or even democratically relevant. There are many of such communities. Think about protest movements, for instance, or think about interest groups that come together around a particular kind of issue that requires change. These are communities that are politically relevant, also in contemporary democracy. But that's not really what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is how the experience of communal life within this context is projected onto democracy as a whole. Does democracy really work like a community would work? And I would, of course, say no. The other caveat is that most communities that exist and of which we are part, think about how many communities you're actually part of. Most of them are not politically relevant, right? The community of tennis players and chess players and I don't know what kind of players there are. So that's certainly not political. And most of those communities are also not in any way democratically organized, actually. They often have hierarchical structures or no structure at all. So I'm basically not interested in actual communities. This might be a drawback, right? It's strange to talk about community and not being interested in actual communities. But that's something that I leave to anthropologists and sociologists and the occasional political scientist. What I'm interested in is how people in democratic theory speak about community. I'm going to limit myself today to one particular example. There are many, of course, examples that I could use, but I'm going to focus on one example, which is sort of a drift in the language of community that you can observe in American political thought from the sort of liberal center to some kind of far-right authoritarianism. And that anti-democratic authoritarian drift in the language of community has occurred over the last 40 years, a little bit more than 40 years, let's say 50 years. You can observe this also elsewhere. This is not a specifically American phenomenon. You can also see that in France. So the rise of the Nouvelle Droite, for instance, of the far-right public intellectuals in France are also centered on notions of community, but you also see it among the post-Marxist left, and I'm thinking about authors such as Antonio Negri and Michael Hart. I'm not going to discuss them today because they're a little bit more complicated. So, first, however, since we're in the 21st century, I actually have to walk over here, why I'm not going to talk about the election at all. And I think that's enough reason. I have no idea and I have no knowledge about the election or why it went wrong, or, so I'm just going to skip this entirely. And I'm not interested in it. Rather, what I'm interested in is some contentious argument about political theory. So the basic claim I want to make is that confusing democracy with community contributes actually to democratic backsliding, because it leads to unrealistic expectations about the demands of political life under the conditions of pluralism that we face in democracy. We have unrealistic expectations if we believe that democracy as a whole is going to work like our neighborhood, if you live in a nice neighborhood. Sometimes, you might not get along with your neighbors, which is, more appropriate as an image of democracy. Refashioning democracy as a whole, and especially imagining liberal constitutional democracy as a community, leads to authoritarian drift, and that happens in the language of political theory on the left as well as it does on the right. Okay, now this is the claim, and it's of course a contentious claim at this present moment. So let's delve a little bit deeper into this. Of course, it seems to us that democracy is somehow related to community. Surely it requires that citizens share some common ground somehow. And would a critique of community, rejecting community somehow, not also lead to sort of like a doubt about the value of democracy, especially in these uncivil times? And is it not that community, think about your sort of like neighborhood associations or something like this, doesn't community promise some kind of direct form and participatory form of democratic engagement that doesn't need all these anonymous bureaucratic institutions that we of course have in every advanced liberal constitutional democracy? Isn't it nice to return some power back to citizens? I'm not so sure about that one. Okay, here are some examples. So in the early 1990s, you could see Jacques Rancière, a French post-Marxist thinker, defining democracy as the ever-to-be-recommenced invention of a community of equals, which doesn't say very much because it's a basic principle of what democracy is, namely the equality of citizens also under the law, also in terms of political participation. Of course, in reality, that is actually inherently limited, because not all of us, despite this normative principle of equality, have access to political participation in the way in which, for instance, we here in this room have access to, because we're quite privileged in many ways. Nancy Rosenblum is an interesting example. She wrote a fantastic book, an interesting book, on good neighbors as a model for democracy. And she points out that neighborhoods and neighbors really are a model for democracy. It's the democracy of everyday life that kind of entails reciprocity, speaking out, to live and let live, and it's an experience of pluralism. It's all very nice, and she has this kind of like broader argument where, well, the success of American history is that America has always been a history of good neighbors. She, of course, ignores sort of like settler colonialism, genocide of indigenous populations, but nevertheless, a history of good neighbors. It should make us just a little bit, just a tiny little bit, skeptical whether we can actually project neighborhoods into democracy as a whole. Because when I think about my whole neighborhood, it's nice and we all get along, but it's terribly homogeneous in many ways. It's homogeneous socioeconomically, for instance. And that's not what countries and populations actually look like. Now, why the sudden interest in community? And it's related to what is in the history of philosophy called the legitimation crisis of democracy. This is a concept that has been introduced by the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, and it seeks to describe a sort of disconnect between the normative ideals of democracy, equality, for instance, participation, and so on, and the actual experienced reality of democracy, which for most people doesn't live up to those normative ideals. So think, for instance, about the way in which liberal constitutional democracy, under the conditions of kind of capitalism that we live, leads actually to a reproduction of inequality. Think about the experience of stagnant wages, of inflation, a general increasing lack of social mobility, a decline of the welfare state. All of those things ultimately limit participation and kind of raise questions for the normative ideal of equality in a democracy. And once you perceive that tension, Basically, many citizens are tempted to ask whether liberal constitutional democracy really delivers what it promises. And that is, of course, a problem for liberal constitutional democracy. This leads to what is called regressive modernization. And that you can observe this development since the 1970s, where you have an increasing affluence among developed Western nations, but at the same time, this increase in affluence runs parallel to regressive political developments. A good example, for instance, is that in an increasingly less regulated labor market, you have certainly more choices in terms of your career development, but what we also observe is a greater precarity and social inequality. Right? I mean, you can choose to become an Uber driver, but you'd be surprised how little you actually earn. I recently had a trip from the airport back to home, and it was $100, and I discussed this with the Uber driver. He earns 30 of that. Right? Imagine how many trips you have to make to actually pay the rent. That's a lived experience of democracy. And this can lead to regressive political movements in the sense that that citizens begin to question the fundamentals of democracy. So the legitimation crisis of democracy is ultimately that liberal constitutional democracy is perceived to not live up to its normative promises, but also not to its material promises. It doesn't live up to the normative promises that it makes in terms of equality, for instance, in terms of the rule of law, but it also doesn't live up, it seems, it's why I emphasize perception, to material promises such as equal access to resources, social mobility, and a fairly stable and growing middle-class society. Now, we can talk about those economic indicators in more detail, of course, later, so I'm going to rush through them a little bit, but that has generated, since the early 1980s, a nostalgia for community and political thought. And I'm going to give you two examples here, and the dates are relevant. Jean-Luc Nancy, a French philosopher, and Roberto Esposito, an Italian philosopher. It's before and after the fall of the Soviet Union, before and after globalization ultimately as well, if you look at this. So it's not linked in any way to the experience of globalization. Jean-Luc Nancy, of course, I mean, it sounds even a little bit more pompous in the original French version. The gravest and most powerful testimony of the modern world is the testimony of the dissolution, the dislocation, or the conflagration of community. And Roberto Esposito gives the whole argument another bit of urgency. On the one hand, we need community. On the other hand, nothing seems to be as remote as community. Now, I want to look a little bit more at, I want to kind of like give you now an example for this sort of like authoritarian or slightly not slightly, but anti-democratic drift in the language of community. And I'm mainly going to focus on some highlights of American political thought. Not all of them are philosophers, some of them are political scientists, and some of them have started innocently in the middle and have moved to the far right. But what is interesting is that much of the talk about community begins to gain shape after 1968, or in the context of 1968, right? And Robert Prager is a good example of that when he kind of leads this. I mean, he doesn't speak himself about community, but rather about citizenship. And he talks, well, citizenship is in a tricky situation, ultimately, given the experience of 1968, right? Detroit and National Democratic Convention, riots on the street. And that leads to some sort of alienation, and we need to address this alienation of citizens. It's a political alienation, not a Marxist economic alienation. Now, and this is sort of like the groundwork ultimately, but the first sign that something's up, you see in 1973, when Wilson Carey McWilliams, a political scientist, publishes a doorstopper of a book, 600 or 700 pages, The Idea of Fraternity in America. Of course, it's a fraternity, right? I mean, that's a different story here. He kind of begins to dream, in order to address this question of alienation, he begins to dream of a new fraternity of citizens that are ultimately modeled on sort of kinship. But he also makes a normative demand. And the normative demand is we need to repeat the American Revolution, but not in a progressive way looking forward, but actually we need to turn things back. I will return to this. Because Wilson Carey McWilliams is the teacher of Patrick Deneen, who's teaching us at Notre Dame at the moment, and who's a little bit more of a questionable figure. He demands a real revolution as a turning back in human affairs. ideally back to the Puritan model, having landed on the shores of America, and it's this community and sort of wooden huts or something like this, and this is really the future of fraternity and citizenship for the United States. Now, what is interesting is that this simply prepares the ground, but in the early 1980s something happens, and that happens in philosophy among the sort of like debate between communitarians and liberals, between those that emphasize that no civic virtues require ultimately a particular social context, and those like Nozick, for instance, who argue, no, it's all about individual rights and individual interests, and Rawls is somewhere in between. The communitarians, like Michael Sandel, ultimately misunderstand Rawls. But the point here is that, as Michael Sandel emphasizes, that in order to sort of like address the fundamental problem of American society, too much individualism and an anonymous state, a large state, we really need to return to civic virtues of neighborliness. There are two problems with this approach, and Sandel is sort of like a centrist ultimately. There are no adequate safeguards for the capture of community by those who do not subscribe to his relatively liberal ideas of what democracy should look like. And the second point that is pointed out by another philosopher, is Michael Walzer, is that Sandel cannot account for a highly diverse society. Yes, this might work in a 18th century New England township, but that's not what the United States looks like in the late 20th century. What is interesting, though, is that on the right, with Jean Bethke Elstein, for instance, on the right, this new communitarian talk is picked up immediately. On exactly the same year, she publishes an article on feminism, family, and community and dissent. Despite the title feminism in there, it's an argument against feminism. She actually sees feminism as an example of high individualism in a capitalist society that needs to be overcome. And of course, what does she argue for? A revitalized form of family life and community. And she gives some examples: families, churches, self-help movements, I'm not quite sure what those are, volunteer activities, and trade unions. And you would think like, well, that sounds sort of leftish, trade unions. But the reason why she mentions trade unions is because they have corporate structures and are supposed to look out for the members of their own community without help from the social welfare state. So she's ultimately presenting an argument of community against the state. And it's exactly this argument that continues for a while until community is folded back into the state at the end of this history. Now, an interesting case is the Catholic law professor Mary Ann Glandon. She publishes a book called Rights Talk in 1991. On the surface, this book sounds like a lawyer arguing that there is too much litigation and that's a problem for American legal culture, and certainly is a little bit of a problem. But underneath this, how to address this ultimately is a return to community. And again, in 1991, she argues that excessive individualism that we experience in the United States is a consequence, actually, of the civil rights movement, because the civil rights movement gave individual rights, and individual rights lead just to a new tribalism and endless negotiation. So we need an alternative, and that alternative, like Elstein said before, relies on families and religious communities as the seedbeds of civic virtues, and that family obligations are a source of civic life that is fanning outward across the Republic. If you have enough families that behave in the right way, it just fans out across the entire society. Good luck with that, but this is an example of how a particular understanding of a small community is projected into democracy as a whole. But we can move on a little bit to more recent times, and you'll find another Harvard professor, Adrian Vermeulen, who is a controversial Harvard law professor, who published a book 2 years ago on common good constitutionalism, or as I joke with a philosophy friend of mine, common good authoritarianism. Because he argues here that the main aim of his version of constitutionalism is actually not at all maximizing individual autonomy or even minimizing the abuse of power. The abuse of power is perfectly fine under this sort of constitutionalism. Rather, constitutionalism should be seen as an act of purposive and reasoned rulership that promotes the good of law subjects as members of a flourishing community. Right? So now you can see how Jean Bethke Elstein her argument about sort of community versus the state, now the state moves back in a particular kind of understanding. So, because the crucial point about Vermeulen is the common good, a kind of common good constitutionalism is actually neutral as far as the political system is concerned, right? It is not necessarily democratic. In traditional liberal normative democratic theory, you would have an argument that we need to have a normative legitimacy and justification for a republic or for a liberal constitutional democracy. But Vermeulen argues, no, that's not necessary at all. A range of different regime types can be ordered according to the common good. In fact, democracy is at a disadvantage with all these damn elections, right? They're constantly changing power every 2 years, and it's really, really annoying and creates instability and frustration among the populace, and therefore we need to have a far more authoritarian political system ruled presumably by Harvard lawyers. Now in comes Patrick J. Deneen, a very colorful figure. He's a student of Wilson Carey McWilliams. He wrote his PhD with him, and he started out sort of like slightly right of center, perhaps I would say. But what is interesting about him is not only that he is a political theorist who has moved to the right, and quite far to the right, but he's close friends with J.D. Vance, so we are now really in the electoral present. In fact, Vance wrote a nice glowing preface to his latest book on regime change. Okay, so Patrick Deneen ultimately, he teaches at Notre Dame, he ultimately argues that democracy leads, liberal constitutional democracy, because it is so state-centered, leads to administrative control and the surveillance of citizens, and therefore is ultimately a totalitarian regime in disguise. What we need to have instead, he argues, is that citizens should submit voluntarily to the authority of a moral elite in the service of, surprise, surprise, family, community, and tradition. Of course, that's centered on church and nation. He calls this Aristopopulism. The need to recover practices of democratic citizenship sounds like a great idea, but the practices of democratic citizenship he has in mind had developed antecedent to America's liberal founding, right? He even wants to go back before the founding of the United States, because the American Republic, as he says explicitly, was not to be democratic at all. This was never the idea. And as a result of that, we need a peaceful but vigorous overthrow of the current system. J.D. Vance wrote the preface to that, and we are now a few weeks after the election. Now, this is sort of like the overall authoritarian drift that I wanted to outline with regard to notions of community. And you can observe a similar drift also on the side of the New Left, among political theorists on the New Left. I'm not going to discuss them today because my time runs out, and I want to just get to some general observations. So there are basically 4 observations about community. The first observation is community is ultimately a concept of crisis. It enters the language of modern political thought whenever the normative organization of political life is perceived to fail the interest of citizens or simply of the people. You can actually observe this already in the 15th and 16th century. Community, references to community in different political contexts across Europe pop up whenever there's a crisis. Appeals to community suggest that the institutions of democracy in particular lack some kind of legitimacy, because they seem unable to respond adequately to the pressures that shape the interests, concerns, and desires of citizens. Because citizens, of course, always argue, and you've heard this over and over in this current election or in the run-up to the election, that, well, this government does not represent me. Well, what does this actually mean? Who would represent you? Well, somebody who's like me. But that would be 300 million plus people that would be individually represented, because there are so many differences. So this is not how representative government works. So these are sort of like the illusions that are created by the language of community. Community also promises solidarity and authenticity, an existential relationship to your neighbors that compensates for the perceived failure of representative democracy to live up to its normative promises. It's so much nicer to talk to the neighbor than to talk to the IRS or the DMV. And as a result of that, we want to have our liberal constitutional democracy to be more like a community. But most importantly, community begins to always slowly to emerge as not only a corrective, but increasingly also in the language, as an alternative to the political processes of constitutional democracy. So community has an inherent anti-democratic drift, which has much to do, and sorry for becoming a little bit philosophically here, it has much to do with the political ontology of community. Communities are closed very often, most of the time, and they're closed in one way or the other. They're centered on identities, and there's an inside and an outside. Democratic pluralism is based on the widening of the franchise. Communities are not based on widening the franchise. Now, we need to wonder, of course, whether we can. Now, we don't need to wonder really. I'm just going to say this now. I'm going to conclude now that democracy is not community. And I want to give you an example from the 1780s, an example that is often forgotten by Immanuel Kant in an essay, when he points out that civil society actually does not tend toward consensus, but ultimately it is based on pluralism and antagonism. By antagonism, he means the unsocial sociability of us, that is our tendency to come together in society, coupled with a continual resistance which constantly threatens to break up the society. That's what civil society really is like, and what the situation of democracy is like. Democracy, the function and value of a liberal constitutional democracy, does not consist in building community. It consists in negotiating that which we do not have in common, while leaving pluralism intact. And that is sort of like the crucial point of democracy, to leave pluralism intact while negotiating that pluralism through institutions and norms such as constitutional law. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Carl Caldwell, who might say more about democracy. One of the functions of democracy, of course, is also to protect us from what we really want. We might want community, but be careful about that. All right, Carl.
So almost exactly 8 years ago, Christian and I appeared together at a symposium at the Baker Institute talking about populism. And it's interesting to me now we're not using the language of populism. We're not talking about it. I think at that time, and up to the present, a number of fears appeared about the role of populism, whether it would undermine constitutional democracy, the role of fraud, organized fraud, backsliding, democratic backsliding, and I have another mic. So,
I'm going to follow his lead. I'm not going to do that today. We're not going to repeat some of these old fears because I think things are a little different now. I'm not interested in talking about the election either, not because it doesn't matter. It's going to be implied in everything that I say. I want to step back, as Christian did, talk more generally about what a democracy is, about the inherent dangers in democracy. Democracy is not a formula for stability, right? It's a formula for instability, and that's one of the things we're experiencing today. I have a terrible title. I realize that, but I'm going to try to make all these parts fit together by the end. Namely, we're going to start by talking about how politics is about power. Once you try to take power out and pretend it's not there, like with community, that's when you start seeing issues developing. Second, I'm going to talk about rights and procedures, those magical counterweights that have worked so well in American history to prevent violence. We've never had violence, we've never had civil war, we've never had terror, we've never had fraud, especially not in Texas. And that discussion will lead us into how blurry the line can be. And not by chance. There's a blurry line between democratic and authoritarian government. From there, I'll talk about what happens when you have an openly anti-democratic challenge to the system and the limits that any democracy necessarily faces to respond to it, and end with the question, if our democracy is under assault, who can defend it? So it's going to be a happy and uplifting discussion today. Politics is power. Democracy is not one community and never has been. If democracy existed in the robust sense of a group founded on a pre-existing order of values, why would we need formal processes to make basic decisions? We wouldn't. Democracies exist on a basic level to resolve fundamental controversies over values, exactly where we end up in the previous discussion. There is no national community. There is no single voice because empirically there are multiple voices. Therefore, democracy is at its core formal, and you cannot, I believe, avoid this point. You don't have democracy without form, without rules. It's a process for forming decisions. Put it more clearly, it's a process for channeling power. It's a process for creating laws and commanding people what to do in a way that, in theory, at least involves people in the decision and allows people the ability to reverse a decision. Dictatorship, by contrast, or dictatorships, by contrast, are processes for one person or a group of people to channel their power and to tell people what to do. Commands can be changed, but not through normal processes involving the people in a regular collective way. One of the things that annoys me about recent work on German history, East German history, is saying, oh, but they had petitions. A petition is not a formal way of influencing the government. It's informal. And therefore, if you're nice, you might be responded to. If you're not nice, if the government doesn't like you, maybe not. If we are not believers in a community that quasi-naturally is in agreement about its values, then we support a process for telling people what to do. The fact that law and the state appear to many people to be an alien oppressive force is not what distinguishes democracy from dictatorship. It's what links the two forms of government. Alienation is part of our life. That's one thing. You may have noticed I haven't been talking about rights. I personally am in favor of robust rights and limited political power. Serious, smart thinkers, from James Madison in the United States to Hugo Preuss in Germany in the 1920s to Daniel Cosío Villegas in Mexico, have questioned how much rights can limit power in practice. This isn't because of lack of trying. The problem is a basic one. In a democracy not founded on dictatorship, not founded on theology, who determines the content of rights if not the people or the people elected by the people? This is why James Madison famously referred to rights as parchment barriers. The French revolutionaries were more sympathetic to rights as a set of precepts that legislature and executive might use to measure their action. But the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789 did not contain a word about judicial review. Rights were parchment barriers. So far, I'm talking about rights in a way we would understand it in the United States, like what we see in the Bill of Rights, but let's think of rights in a more extensive sense, like Madison did. Rights also include all those basic rules of political institutions, like how to vote. Who votes? How do you vote? These are the rules that form the ultimate decisions that we might call, hypothetically, the will of the nation, assuming that that will doesn't really exist before the process. So do these rights in a basic sense, I promise I'm going somewhere with this, do these basic rights, including all those procedures, create political power in a democracy? It's kind of weird, right? Because I thought the people did. If they create power, then what rights does the constituted power, the created power, the official, have over them? The people follows a set of rules which it has to follow, and then its representatives can't change the rules that brought them to office. That doesn't make sense. How could the people constituted by merely, or given institutional form, by merely institutional rules in a democracy logically be absolutely bound to those rules? Who is in charge of creating the rules for creating the national will? Maybe it's the lawyers. Maybe it's the deep state. This distrust of rights and procedures is also part of democracy. That constitutes this ongoing populist challenge, which is from the 16th century on. It's part of the discussion. And this leads to the issue, what happens when you have a kind of populist surge against rights and procedures? What happens to a formal democracy? Now let's look at this using one recent example, a random country. We're looking at a country governed by decades by one authoritarian party, After a process of democratization, it's now governed by a voting system that seeks to guard against single-party hegemony. A series of institutions are set up to do that. Starting point, you don't have stupid majoritarian voting. That's silly. You have a combination of direct election and proportional representation, so that a party that gets 45% of the total vote won't end up somehow with 65% of the representatives, which can happen, as we know, in a majoritarian system. Very important. Stop dramatic overrepresentation by simple majority or simple plurality. Second, enforcement of voting representation rules by independent bodies. Third, hard limits on changing the Constitution, 2/3 vote plus state votes. And fourth, a strong Supreme Court with an independent judiciary to ensure that rules are followed. Okay, so we got safeguards in place. Now let's say that one party has a really great vote. 56% of the Congress is a part of this party, 61% victory in the presidency. Oh my God, they got it in their hands, right? And it uses its executive power and legislative power together over 2 terms. First, to replace the members of those independent organs regulating elections with party militants. Second, this is a magic act, to make the majority party a minority party, so they don't get affected by these rules about overrepresentation. You find 2 fake parties, and you buy them. And then your members go over to them. And then suddenly you have 3 poor-suffering minority parties, all controlled by a single party hierarchy that says we need protection. They use rules to benefit minority parties to increase the majority party's representation from 56% to nearly 2/3 of the vote. Use the supermajority created to force the subordination of the judiciary and independent organs to the ruling party through direct coercion or indirect coercion, taking away pensions, for example. Do you want to stay judge if you know a pension? And then the president, elected by a majority of 61% states, the Supreme Court cannot speak against the people because I am speaking directly for the people. The complete unanimity of what looks like a coalition in the Congress is guaranteed by party coercion and party gifts. Now, I'm talking about Mexico this summer. I'm not going to go into details any more deeply. I have friends in the audience who disagree a lot with me on this. The story is not over. This is in process. And I have a friend, in Puebla, who will watch this, who is going to be really pissed off at me. Okay? But I'm just saying, if this is in process, you can see how you can have an outcome which will lead to what they call democratic backsliding. My point is not really about Mexico, but it's an interesting case to look at. It is rather how, through a series of small procedural changes, you can drift from a democracy, or something like a democracy, to a more authoritarian system, to what Kim Shepala has helpfully called a Frankenstate, somewhere between these 2 systems of democracy and dictatorship. These tendencies are not alien to the United States. They have never been. This is not new. Gerrymandering is exactly about that. But more than that, the outright violence and fraud governing many states or local communities in the US before the 50s and 60s, this was normal until after the Second World War. Rights and procedures are malleable. And why is this not surprising, people? Because politics is about power, right? And I mean, come on, political parties represent the people and they want power and they know they're operating in the name of the people. We shouldn't be surprised by this. My point here is that it's not always easy to distinguish, sorry, I didn't have that, to distinguish between a democracy and authoritarian system. I do think there are differences. I think the differences among authoritarian systems is not an either-or thing. If you fail to distinguish between Turkey and Russia today, for example, you're making a huge mistake. Putin graduated from kindergarten of the Frankenstate many years ago, 2 decades ago, to become a dictator. So my point is not that there's no distinctions. My point is there is inherent fuzziness, and this is actually part of what democracy is. Let's shift to a somewhat different question, though. Let's have a more clear-cut case, right? That's what you want. Not for me to be behind a slide, right? Is everyone really angry about that? Yeah, I am. Let's talk about an unambiguous case and militant democracy, how democracy can respond with force to a real challenge. A clear-cut example, this is where I started my historical work. Let's say, hypothetically, a party appears with a leader who explicitly calls for the end of democracy. He's clear about it. He calls for dictatorial rule in the name of the national community. And let's make the case even easier. This man controls a violent militia. Okay, we're talking about Germany in the 20s. We could actually talk about a number of democracies at different times which have faced explicitly anti-democratic leaders of violent groups seeking direct power. The accusation later made against Germany's first democracy was that it was unable to protect itself. It was too democratic. Famous argument from Karl Lowenstein in 1937, the lack of militancy of the Weimar Republic against subversive movements, the mediocre bureaucrats acting as German statesmen, a self-destroying legalism reveals an almost tragicomical picture of half-hearted laggard and thoroughly ineffective methods of dealing with subversive technique. He says, no government took on the challenge. I don't think most historians today agree at all. The Weimar Republic took many measures to try to deal with violent internal challenges on left and right. They put in place laws against hate speech. They put in place laws against terrorist acts, especially political terrorist acts, adding additional penalties onto just a normal terrorist act. They enabled the government to ban violent militias. Democracies as systems of power have lots of ways to protect violence. That wasn't the issue. Let's see what happened with just one example. It has to do with banning militias. It has to be a decision by someone whether or not to ban a militia, right? I mean, so they don't magically get banned in any system. It has to be a decision about whether to apply the measure. The judiciary has to enforce it. The conservative government in 1932, with an aging, stolid general for president, chose in 1932 not to prosecute members of the Nazi militias, to remove a ban on Nazi militias intended to lessen violence in the streets. Details don't matter here. What I'm pointing out is a democratically elected government uses the political moment to gain votes, not knowing, of course, the outcome of the political situation. They're trying to gain relative advantage. That's what parties do. Again, the result was violence, increased delegitimization of the state, complete legislative paralysis, and collapse. From Lowenstein's point of view, the problem was that these methods were still following liberal democratic principles of equal treatment. The proper path was to treat anti-democratic parties with anti-democratic measures. Lowenstein argued for robust, violent measures that would violate basic principles of democratic inclusion and equality before the law. Okay, that was what he said. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me just at an obvious level, but that's what he argued. He said other democratic governments have to take these actions. Let's turn the problem around. I've been asking up to this point, kind of in terms of values, should a democratic government ban an anti-democratic movement? That's been implicit there. The deeper question is, can it? Can a democratic movement ban an anti-democratic movement that at its greatest power commanded over 40% of the vote and still remain democratic? I don't know. How can it do it without becoming a dictatorship? There is a difference between a clear set of laws against people engaging in terrorism, in violence, carrying weapons in public, engaging in fraud, etc., on the one hand, and laws prohibiting a broad social movement, especially in a democracy. With this in mind, we end this section with a really positive, upbeat quote from Hans Kelsen. Popular rule cannot maintain itself against its own people. And for those of you who don't know Hans Kelsen, he's very famous because he shares my birthday. I also have to say that if this paper had footnotes, you'd see that Kelsen is running through it. So our question, is democracy therefore defenseless against internal enemies? Again, coercion is certainly possible. Law is coercive, it limits behavior. Violence can be punished, fraud can be prosecuted. The people and the representatives in a democracy can defend democracy, or not. And that's the problem. There was a conscious decision not to ban a militia in order to attract voters by a specific group. That brings us back. Let me kind of pull things together here before I end. Was this what we've talked about? And I think you're starting to see how these different points, which seem so different, start to come together. We're talking about power. We're not starting with the people in agreement about values. We're talking about power, which we impose on others. Rights in a broad sense are not just there to be nice to people. They form a process of making decisions in a democracy, but they have to be approved, applied, amended by the people or the people's representatives. A democratic constitutional system is by definition open, not closed. It is amenable to change. Change may not move in a democratic direction. Militant democracy, a rousing call that has served important coercive aims, actually, it has, against fascists after 1945 in Europe. But it also employs coercive and violent measures to suppress the opposition. When the Soviet Union invaded Hungary in 1956, it did so to defend people's democracy. When Pinochet's army took over Chile in 1973, Pinochet said, we're responding to the breakdown of democracy and the takeover of the country by a minority party. Lowenstein himself laid the foundation for the US-supported dirty war against subversives in Latin America during the early 1940s, which continues to poison Latin American society to this day. So the whole history of militant democracy is not really that positive. A dictatorship can also claim to be defending core values, even democracy, while trampling on democracy. And in fact, this is really getting to the key of what I want to say here, because it relates as well to populism. Assigning the right to one constituted power to speak as the nation, to decide what the basic values of the nation are, be it the president or the Supreme Court or the army, is tantamount to setting up a dictatorship. What is less cool than the Federalists, right? We don't tend to read the Federalist Papers. I invite you to reread them and look at their obsession with the problem of usurpation. They are constantly saying any one of these offices is elected can claim to represent the people. The people is always changing. The people needs to be protected somehow, but somehow these officials can stand above them for good reason. They're thinking, among other things, about the possibility that the army will speak in the name of the people. A real example from the courts of the Revolutionary War. When that happens, it's no longer the people who are speaking, and here is really the key point. When the president claims to speak in the name of the entire people, the people is also no longer speaking. The president doesn't have that right. Nowhere have I said that values, incidentally, are not part of democracy. The opposite. They're essential to democracy. Democracy is the process for articulating them. That's its function. These values of democracy are rather abstract, but they exist. There's lots of lists of these. This is one of my favorites from Dahl. Just 6 basic things. The political scientists will recognize them, right? Elections are good. Suffrage rights. Everyone should vote. Inclusive. Equality of votes, et cetera, et cetera. I have a quick question for all of you. When you were voting 2 weeks ago, did you think about abstract questions of democracy at all, like whether we should have elections or whether there should be rights or whether any of these things were in danger? How many of you did think about any of these abstract questions? According to the polls, 7% of Americans did. 7? Now, Bob's not here to yell at me, Bob Stein. Okay. I don't find that convincing. I think if it's someone who goes out and votes because they want the price of hamburger to be less, the first thing they're thinking is, I have the right to vote that the price of hamburger is less. They're making a decision about values. I actually think that's still a prior thing before you vote, but maybe I'm just optimistic. I do think, though, that these are pretty important values that at certain points do start coming into question. While I, like Christian, reject the idea of a pre-existing national community values, I do think values can be articulated. I don't reject the idea of community at all. I reject the idea of a national community. Instead, I think communities based on values, communities plural, they're not inessential. They're what democracy is about. Not closed but open communities, communities articulating and defending values publicly. When you're talking to someone who's talking about hamburger and voting, you say, didn't you like voting? This is what happens in everyday life in a democracy. Communities are raising hard questions like what I've been raising, but not on this abstract level. That's one thing to keep in mind. The defense of democratic values, furthermore, can only be carried out on the basis, or within, I should say, the fractured, contentious, self-interested, jealous, unequal, hate-filled, fear-filled, and passionate world of the democratic citizenry. There is no alternative. In contentious times, the arguments are going to be contentious. The deportation of workers from this country that is going to happen in January, we don't know exactly how, we don't know the process, but I think it's quite likely to involve bloodshed and perhaps murder and certainly suspension of legal norms. The people being deported will not be citizens. Do these actions fit with your values about democracy? That's an actually interesting question that's worth bringing up. To summarize this happy-go-lucky discussion, a democracy is a ship at sea without some patron saint guiding it through the waves. Democracy, in other words, is about you and not your savior. 4 more words. Over to you, audience. Thank you.